5 years ago, successful surgeon Paul's life was destroyed overnight. The friends he trusted betrayed him. Now he was free, but the past wouldn't let go. A snowstorm, a frozen lake, and a woman on the thin line between life and death. When the truth came out, who would survive? 5 years. After 5 long, cold, and unfair years, Paul was finally free. But this freedom began with the steps of a man still carrying a heavy burden inside. As the massive gray gate of the prison slowly opened, Paul's eyes involuntarily drifted upward. The gray walls seemed to symbolize the weight of the years he had spent there, just like the deep regret and disappointment he felt inside. He took a deep breath. The outside world felt strangely foreign after the 5 years inside. Right outside the gate, there were 2 figures waiting for him, Simon and Tim. 2 men who had never lost their friendship and had never stopped believing in him. Paul's steps slowed. When he made eye contact with them, something inside him broke. They had stood by him in that court, shouted that he was innocent, but they couldn't save him from this fate. Simon took a step toward Paul with a bittersweet but sincere smile on his face. "Brother," he said, his voice trembling slightly. Tim tilted his head slightly and extended his hand to Paul. Despite the anger and disappointment burning inside him, Paul felt the warmth of the friendship he had missed for so many years. His hands were sweaty. After all this time, re-entering the outside world made him uneasy. But the past wasn't going to let him go that easily. Paul had once been one of the best surgeons in the country. When people heard his name, they trusted him, entrusted their lives to his hands. But now, those hands, the skilled, life-saving hands, could no longer touch an operating table. Before going to prison, he had worked at a large private hospital. Simon and Tim were there too. Their friendship had evolved alongside their professional success. That was until that dreadful day came. It all started with an operation. It was supposed to be a simple procedure. At least, that's what they thought. When Paul reviewed the patient's file, he believed it would be a routine operation. But the file was wrong. Everything had been written incorrectly. And no one had noticed. As he always did, Paul had started the surgery meticulously, trusting the information in the file. But something went wrong. When the patient had an unexpected complication, everything turned upside down. Despite all his efforts, Paul lost the patient. He remembered the fear and shock that flooded him at that moment. But the real nightmare began after the surgery. The patient's family was very powerful and influential. The hospital acted quickly to cover it up, but the truth couldn't be hidden. Paul was made the scapegoat. The media plastered his name across the headlines, blaming him for the life lost due to a doctor's mistake. In court, Paul's defenses had been inadequate. Those accusing him used their power to turn the process in their favor. What Paul said didn't matter. A man who had saved lives for years was now being judged like a murderer. 5 years. During those dark, painful, hopeless 5 years, the only thing Paul could think about was how justice could be so ruthless. Now, here he was. He had to take baby steps to return to life. But he was no longer the old Paul. His identity had been nothing more than being a doctor. But now, he would never be able to practice surgery again. Simon and Tim placed a friendly hand on Paul's shoulder. "Come on, let's get out of here. It's time to stop thinking about the past and start thinking about the future." Paul lifted his head and took a deep breath. The future. Was there really a future waiting for him? To find the answer to that question, he first had to free himself from the shadows of the past. His friends had organized a little morale gathering for Paul, renting a house by the lake. Everything was ready. It wasn't going to be a big crowd. Paul could barely handle crowds anyway. He gently turned the wine glass in his hand and leaned it against the cold surface of the window. "How lucky I am to have such good friends," he thought to himself. A lot had changed in his life over the past 5 years, but Simon and Tim were still here. They had stood by him in his worst times, and now they were trying to help him adjust back to life. Outside, snowflakes silently drifted down, and the lake's surface started to be covered with a thin layer of ice. Despite the cold air, the warm flames in the fireplace gave the room a peaceful atmosphere. After taking a long, relaxing shower, Paul put on some comfortable clothes and headed toward the kitchen. Simon and Tim were busy preparing food. Paul grabbed a glass from the counter and poured himself some wine. As he took the first sip, his eyes once again landed on the window. The magnificent view of the lake was calm and serene. "I wish life could be this peaceful." Just then, Simon's voice broke his thoughts. "Paul, it looks like a few more guests will be coming." Paul frowned and turned around. "Who?" he asked, a surprised look on his face. Simon and Tim exchanged a glance and chuckled briefly. Simon shrugged with a slightly teasing expression. "Come on, buddy. You've been with the guys for 5 years. We invited a few of our female friends." Paul shot Simon a sharp look. "That's rude," he said, with a mockingly harsh tone. Tim giggled, shaking his head as he continued chopping vegetables. "Take it easy, Paul," he said with a light smile. "Simon switched to another hospital, and he's got new co-workers. He just wants to get to know them. Since they're here, he invited them to dinner. That's all." Paul still felt a little uncomfortable, but he didn't say much more. He took another sip of his wine and turned his gaze back outside. The view really was perfect. But the unease inside him didn't seem to disappear so easily. Paul gently lifted his glass and glanced around the table. The meal was ready, the atmosphere was warm and relaxing. For the first time since he got out of prison, he felt like he could really breathe. The future was uncertain. He didn't know what to do or how to shape his life. But tonight, he decided to just enjoy the moment. As Simon and Tim set the table, Paul silently watched them. These kinds of dinners, which they used to have often, now felt strangely nostalgic to him. He felt a long-standing void slowly starting to fill. Just as everything was being placed, the doorbell rang. As Simon moved toward the door, Paul took a deep breath without thinking. The guests had arrived. He felt a little awkward, but he tried not to show it. When the door opened, 2 women stepped inside along with the cold air. Olivia and Lena. Olivia was blonde, with a sweet expression. There was a genuine light in her eyes. She was carrying a bottle of wine and looking around the room with excitement. Her energy seemed to warm up the room instantly. As soon as she stepped inside, she didn't hide her excitement. "This place is amazing, and it smells wonderful. We're so hungry," she said with childlike enthusiasm. Lena, on the other hand, was different. She had brown hair and striking blue eyes. But she had a more reserved presence. When she entered the room, she hesitated for a moment, her eyes quickly flicking to Paul and the others. Then, she smiled gently and, in a calm but captivating voice, said, "Hello." Paul immediately felt the different energy in her voice. The room seemed to fill for a moment with the echo of that sound. She had a quiet but powerful presence. Unlike Olivia's liveliness, Lena's calmness left a deeper impression. Simon smiled lightly and gestured toward the table. "Shall we sit?" he said warmly. As everyone took their seats around the table, Paul looked at the people around him. Just a few hours ago, he had been alone. Now, there was warm conversation, the smell of food, and a liveliness he hadn't felt in years. As everyone started eating, Paul paused for a moment. For the first time in a long time, he truly felt like he was here. He decided to set the past aside for a while and just enjoy the moment. Paul gently rotated his glass in his hand. Olivia's energy still dominated the table. "She's a pediatrician," he thought. She had mentioned her job twice, with enthusiasm and passion. Lena, however, was quiet, and she hadn't talked about herself. Unable to hold back his curiosity, Paul gently asked. "What about you, Lena?" Olivia and Lena laughed at the same time. Paul paused for a moment, not understanding why they were laughing. Lena, shaking her head slightly, said, "I'm not a doctor, unfortunately. I work in hospital management." She paused for a moment, then added, "My family owns a chain of private hospitals." Paul raised his eyebrows, unable to hide his surprise. For a moment, he exchanged a meaningful glance with Simon. "Is this like inviting your boss to dinner?" he thought to himself. Simon smiled faintly but didn't say anything. The conversation quickly shifted, and the mood lightened again. People were eating, wine was being poured into glasses, and laughter accompanied the meal. Everything seemed fine, until Olivia suddenly turned to Paul and, with an innocent question, changed the atmosphere. "So, where do you work, Paul?" In an instant, the mood at the table shifted. Silence fell over them. Simon and Tim both looked away. Olivia didn't seem to notice the shadow on Paul's face, she had just asked a simple question. But Paul's face showed a slight tension. He placed his glass on the table and took a sip of water. His throat was dry. Then, without looking away, he spoke in a calm voice. "I was a surgeon," he said. "Surgeon, past tense. But there were some issues. I'm not anymore." Olivia froze for a moment. She now seemed to understand something, but she didn't know what to say. Lena looked carefully at Paul, furrowing her brows and tilting her head thoughtfully. "I know some very successful and powerful lawyers. If you want dash." Paul quickly grabbed his glass and, with a sharp movement, poured himself more wine. He didn't want this conversation to go on. "Thank you, Lena," he said, his voice soft but with a tone of finality. "It's too late." He took a sip of his wine. But in that moment, he felt as though his soul was suffocating. He thought that if he stayed at the table any longer, he would drown. He needed to breathe. He made up an excuse. "I'm going to the bathroom," he said, trying to keep his voice indifferent as he stood up. As he left the table, he walked quietly into the next room. There was an odd heaviness inside him. He had just gotten out of prison, but was he really free? Meanwhile, Olivia and Lena had gone out to the veranda, watching the lake. The snow was still gently falling, and the surface of the lake had frozen a little more. A light breeze swept over the veranda, and Lena, with thoughtful eyes, gazed at the horizon. Simon and Tim were busy clearing the table. But both of them were wondering whether Paul would come back soon. Because this moment was harder for him than they had realized. Paul was still in another room, trying to collect his thoughts. The weight of everything that had happened was pressing down on his shoulders. Olivia's innocent question had ruined the entire evening, creating a whirlpool inside him that he couldn't escape. He could hear sounds from outside, but he couldn't focus on them. He noticed Tim calling from the veranda. "We're having cigars, come on," Tim said, reaching through the veranda door. Paul was tired. His mind was as heavy as his body. Could something so small, just a sentence, really have broken him like this? He had waited 5 years for this moment. To feel free again, to give his life direction. But now it felt like the prison walls were still around him. "I'll be there in a minute," he murmured. But he couldn't find the strength to get up. Tim and Simon went out onto the veranda. The cold air settled on them like a fine mist. Inside, the fireplace blazed, but outside, the cold seemed to have settled on the veranda. Tim lit his cigarette and took a deep breath. Simon, however, was silent. He could feel the weight of the thoughts turning in his mind. Eventually, Simon broke the silence. "I don't know, man, sometimes. I think we've gone too far," he said, his voice a trembling whisper. Tim raised an eyebrow and looked at him, shaking his head slightly before angrily turning his cigarette in his hand. "Hey! Get a grip, he hissed. He glanced around. Inside, the girls were warming themselves by the fire. Olivia was almost asleep. Lena sat quietly, deep in thought. Tim lowered his voice even further, turning to Simon. This conversation couldn't be overheard. If we hadn't changed the patient's file, Paul would have been the chief doctor, he said, a harsh expression crossing his face. If Paul had been chief, you wouldn't be seeing this many patients now, let me tell you. Paul wouldn't have taken bribes, he wouldn't have turned a blind eye to you seeing patients outside working hours or doing unregistered surgeries. You know that. Simon's breath quickened, but Tim didn't stop. And most importantly, he said, through clenched teeth, eventually, what happened to that girl would have come out. If Paul had been outside, he would have figured out what we did. It was an accident, but no one would have believed it, Simon. He would have reported us to the police. We had no choice. Tim's voice had grown more heated. He could see the doubt on Simon's face, the weight of what he'd said. Simon's conscience was bleeding, but Tim couldn't accept that. And then, the last thing that should have happened, happened. A vase fell to the ground. The noise cut through the night like a knife. Both of them turned quickly. Lena. She was looking at them with fearful eyes. Her face was pale in the firelight. Her body was shaking slightly. Olivia was deep in sleep, unaware of anything. Simon and Tim froze. A huge secret, a murder and a betrayal, had now reached someone else's ears. Simon tried to recover the situation. We were checking pulses. Are you into theater? There's a great play this weekend, we were talking about that. His voice was shaky and meaningless. Even he didn't believe what he had just said. Lena didn't respond. From her eyes, it was clear she had heard everything and understood it. Paul had been set up. Probably to cover up a murder. And now, Lena knew. Lena understood from Tim's gaze he was in trouble. The wave of fear inside her grew, and she was about to shout at Olivia when Simon suddenly moved. His hand quickly covered Lena's mouth. Her scream turned into a muffled murmur. Tim swiftly intervened, grabbing her arms tightly. Together, they lifted Lena, silently closing the veranda door behind them. Lena tried to break free. She wanted to scream, struggle, wake Olivia. But the two men were more professional than she expected. Within seconds, her breath was cut off, and her voice was stifled. Simon looked at Tim in the dark veranda, his voice barely a whisper. What are we going to do? Tim's face was expressionless, as if he had already calculated this moment. We have no choice, he said in a cold voice. We'll say she's missing. They quickly began walking toward the lake shore. Lena understood that moment. Her breath quickened, her heart pounded wildly. They're going to throw me into the lake. With that thought, she began struggling with all her strength. But Simon and Tim continued to move forward without faltering. It was like they had done this before. Lena pinned all her hope on one move. She bit Tim's hand. The man staggered for a moment. At the same time, Lena instinctively screamed, but it was a weak, muffled scream. A sound that quickly disappeared into the stomach and the ice. Tim quickly regained control. Calm down, he hissed through clenched teeth. His jaw was tight. No one had heard. As he lightly shook his bitten hand, Simon tightened his grip on Lena's arms. They had to be even more careful now. When they reached the dock, the cold, silent surface of the lake stretched before them. The ice was covered with a thin layer, but it was clear where Lena would fall. Meanwhile, Paul was inside. His subconscious was whispering to him that something was wrong. He had heard a faint sound. But he didn't pay attention. He had promised himself he wouldn't think about it today. I'm going to have a good time today, he thought to himself. My friends rented this place for me. He stood up and walked out of the room. His eyes first went to the fireplace. Olivia had fallen into a deep sleep in the warmth of the fire. The atmosphere was too quiet. Paul walked toward the veranda. When the cold air hit his face, he saw 3 silhouettes by the lake. Tim, Simon, and... was there someone else? He couldn't make it out clearly in the dark. At that moment, Tim and Simon noticed Paul too. They stood still for a few seconds. Then, they began walking calmly toward the veranda. Paul's eyes were on them, but his instincts were trying to tell him something. Simon's arms, Tim's pants were slightly wet. Clumsy Tim fell, Simon said, laughing. Tim followed his lead, shaking his head slightly. Exactly, buddy, I slipped on the ice. Paul squinted. Something was off, but his mind was occupied with other thoughts. Simon pulled a cigar from his pocket and offered it to Paul. Came from Cuba. It has a great aroma. Paul hesitated for a moment before taking the cigar. He took a deep breath and let the smoke rise into the sky. The tension inside him hadn't eased. But Lena was nowhere to be found. Paul felt something was off. The unease inside him was growing. As his eyes scanned the surroundings, he noticed something was missing. Where's Lena? Paul's voice was serious and clear. Simon hesitated slightly before turning around. Isn't she inside? Paul shook his head. No. She might have gone outside, but it's freezing. She would have come back by now. Tim raised his eyebrows and shrugged his shoulders. He didn't seem bothered. Maybe she left, he said indifferently. She's a bit of a snob, rich and all. Paul furrowed his brows as he heard the lack of concern in Tim's voice. Something wasn't right. The strange feeling gnawing at him grew heavier in his chest. He looked around. The surface of the lake was covered with a thin layer of ice. But something caught his attention. Near the dock, the ice had just started to form. But on the smooth surface, there was a small but noticeable crack. Paul's breath quickened. The ice looked like a smooth blanket, but there was a hole where it shouldn't be. Tim and Simon hadn't noticed the worry on Paul's face. They were already making plans. Let's change our clothes, they said hastily. And they quickly walked inside. But Paul couldn't move. Something clicked in his mind. Why were Tim's pants and Simon's arms wet? They had said Tim fell into the lake, but the ice was still very thin. Why was it only cracked at one specific point? His steps involuntarily moved toward the lake. Something gleamed on the ground. A ring. Paul bent down and picked it up. It was Lena's ring. His chest tightened. All the pieces were coming together. In the fresh snow, there were strange tracks. Not just walking tracks. There had been a struggle. And then, he saw the blood. As he took a few steps toward the dock, there was a fresh, dark red stain at the edge of the board. Paul's body moved suddenly. Without thinking, he plunged into the lake. The water was like ice, seeping into his bones. But he didn't care. Under the ice, he scanned for shadows. And he saw her. Lena's white shirt was suspended in the dark waters of the lake. She was motionless. Paul swam with all his strength toward Lena. He grabbed her. He wrapped his arms around her body and pushed upward, toward the dock. He himself pulled himself up with great effort. Her face was turned toward the water. She had a terrible wound on her head. And she wasn't breathing. Paul closed his eyes and silenced his mind. There was no time to think anymore. He was a surgeon. His first reflex was to save a life. He pressed both hands against Lena's chest. Come on, Lena. Come on. He pressed again. Again. And again. A miracle happened. Water gushed from Lena's mouth. Her lungs took in a deep breath. Her eyes suddenly opened, her body trembled. With all her fear, all her pain. Gathering all her strength, she whispered one word, "Help." Paul quickly lifted her into his arms. They were both freezing. He ran inside, toward the warmth of the fireplace. "Olivia," he shouted. The sound filled the entire house. At that moment, Tim and Simon came out of their rooms. And they saw Paul, with someone alive in his arms. Lena was alive. Tim's face froze in shock. Simon's eyes widened. Their plans were shattered. But this was only the beginning of everything. As soon as Olivia saw Lena in that condition, she quickly grabbed her phone. She sent an emergency message to the hospital. In the cold of the night, her professional instincts kicked in. The ambulance was already on its way. Tim and Simon stood frozen in shock, their pupils had shrunk, their bodies were stone still. They knew it was over. Paul turned to Olivia, trying to hide the panic inside him. "Lena will be fine," he said, his voice harsh but under control. Olivia carefully checked Lena's head. It was still bleeding, but it had slowed. She checked her pulse, listened to her breath. With the warmth of the fireplace, her body was slowly recovering. "She must have fallen," Olivia said, speaking with a professional perspective. But her eyes were still filled with concern. Paul didn't say anything. It had nothing to do with falling, and he knew that, but now wasn't the time to speak. Lena opened her eyes. Her first breath was irregular, and she was shivering. Her whole body trembled. But her eyes immediately locked on Simon and Tim, and in that moment, everything was revealed. The fear in her eyes spoke before her words. She looked at them with deep, indescribable horror. Tim looked away. Simon couldn't even breathe. Lena's lips parted. She didn't have the strength to say the words, but she still whispered "murderers." Time in the room came to a halt. Paul held his breath. Olivia turned to Lena, shocked. Tim and Simon. In that moment, they realized they were already dead. As the ambulance sirens tore through the silence of the night, Paul deliberately avoided speaking to Tim and Simon. A spark of doubt had ignited within him, but his mind kept rejecting it. Lena's fear in her eyes, the words she whispered echoed in his ears, "murderers." This one word had pierced his mind like a knife. When they arrived at the hospital, the doctors quickly took control of Lena. Her condition was stable, the wound on her head was treated, and her consciousness was being monitored. Olivia was also taking care of her. Paul kept his distance from Simon and Tim throughout the entire process. But the inevitable eventually came. Tim and Simon found him in the hospital waiting area. They were in a panic. "Paul. That woman is schizophrenic. She's been having psychotic episodes for a long time." Simon blurted out, his voice trembling. Tim wasn't far behind. "I swear, you don't believe this nonsense, do you?" Paul listened to them. But he didn't respond. He knew a part of him wanted to believe. "They wouldn't do this to me. They wouldn't set me up." But Lena wasn't lying. Her eyes, her face, her voice. This wasn't a madwoman's hallucination. At that moment, in the hospital room, Lena had woken up. And she had called the police. When Paul went to her, she was telling everything. The whole truth. Paul was shocked. Something inside him had shattered. As Lena spoke, his mind tried to piece everything together. But he couldn't believe it. "No," Paul said, his voice turning into a fragile whisper. "They wouldn't do this to me. They wouldn't set me up. This has to be a mistake." But the police didn't listen to him. They took the statement and left the room. Lena looked at Paul. There was fear and gratitude in her eyes. "Thank you for saving me." Paul stared at her blankly. He still couldn't accept the truth. The police came back to the hospital to speak with Paul again. But this time, they had evidence. Paul was about to witness his world come crashing down. The police placed Simon's statement and interrogation records in front of him. Simon had confessed everything. Paul opened the interrogation records and, line by line, he began to fall into hell. Simon's voice echoed in the recordings, "That woman had to die. Because while Tim was taking care of her, he did something unprofessional." Paul's blood ran cold. Since her consciousness was closed off anyway, he made unethical jokes. Paul's hands started to tremble. I stayed silent. But the situation escalated. At one point, the woman opened her eyes. We realized she remembered everything. We put her back to sleep with more drugs. She remembered everything. Paul's stomach turned. The day of the operation. The worst day of Paul's life. Tim and I made a plan. We had to get rid of both Paul and the woman. The file was changed. Paul was made to look guilty. And we continued our lives as if nothing happened. For 5 years, everything was fine, until Lena showed up. Paul lifted his eyes from the interrogation record. There was a buzzing in his head. The whole world went dark. Tim and Simon. His closest friends. They had set him up. And they had destroyed his life to cover up a murder. Paul couldn't breathe. This was the final act of his 5-year nightmare. When the day of the trial arrived, Paul felt an indescribable weight inside. Simon and Tim were on trial. All these years, he never imagined that the people he considered his closest friends could turn into terrifying monsters. The two men he spent his college years with, laughing together, dreaming together, always thinking they supported him, had tried to destroy him. Now, they were answering for their actions in front of justice. Paul had to testify in court. His words got caught in his throat. Telling the truth was painful. But in the end, he described the horrible things they had done. Simon and Tim no longer wore friendly expressions. The silence in the courtroom had sealed their fate. When the judge announced their sentences, Paul felt like everything was over. But the emptiness inside Paul was still there. 5 years. His life had been taken from him. But he wasn't alone in this fight. Lena had been by his side throughout the trial. Not just with gratitude, but with true friendship and trust. Paul had lost the life he built over the years, but Lena had given him a new beginning. She helped him return to his profession. Her family owned a chain of private hospitals. And Paul became the most successful surgeon in the history of those hospitals. Paul had regained the identity he lost years ago. Not just his profession, but himself as well. Lena didn't just thank him from the heart. She gave him back the life he had lost. And for the first time, Paul truly felt free. If you want to hear more engaging and impactful stories, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Make sure to like, comment, and support with a super like.